The call came in at 11:47 on a Tuesday morning, and nobody in that boardroom had any idea that the man sitting quietly in the corner, the one in the slightly wrinkled grey t-shirt, nursing a black coffee and scrolling through his phone, was about to be the only thing standing between their company and complete collapse. His name was Langston Price, and he was 38 years old, and he had not slept in 22 hours. Not because he couldn't, not because something was wrong, but because that was simply what Langston Price did when a problem needed solving. He stayed with it. He turned it over in his mind the way other people turned stones on a beach, quietly, methodically, without any particular urgency, until something revealed itself underneath. Most people in that room didn't know his name. They knew the name of his company, Nova Bridge Capital, the way you know the name of a river without ever thinking about the water that formed it. Nova Bridge had restructured 3 failing hospital networks in the last 4 years, had quietly absorbed 2 regional banks that were hemorrhaging deposits, and turned them profitable within 18 months, had, without a single press release, prevented what economists would later describe as a mid-sized municipal bond crisis in a state that shall go unnamed. Because Langston Price had no interest in being named. He was 6 feet tall and lean in the way of someone who ran not for fitness but for thinking. He wore no watch. He carried no briefcase. The phone in his hand was a model 2 generations behind the current one, not because he couldn't afford an upgrade, but because it did everything he needed it to do, and he saw no reason to want more than that. The receptionist on the 42nd floor of Hargrove and Slade Financial Partners had looked at him when he stepped off the elevator and assumed, with a confidence she would later find mortifying, that he was there to fix something with the HVAC system. She had asked him, pleasantly enough, if he was with the building management. He had said no. She had asked if he was a courier. He had said no. She had looked at his t-shirt, grey, clean, nothing remarkable about it, and then at the sleek glass lobby around her, the kind of space designed to make people feel the weight of money before anyone had said a word about it. And she had asked him who he was there to see. He told her. The name he gave was Hargrove himself. Elliot Hargrove, 61 years old, founder and CEO of Hargrove and Slade, a man whose calls did not go to voicemail, and whose assistant had a waiting list, and whose face had appeared on 3 magazine covers in the last decade, always slightly turned to show his better side. The receptionist, her name was Tiffany Owens, 24, 8 months into this job, conscientious and ambitious, and genuinely good at what she did, had smiled the way people smile when they are about to explain something uncomfortable. She said, "Mr. Hargrove is in an executive session right now. Do you have an appointment?" Langston said yes. She looked at her screen. She looked at it for a long time, the way people look at something when they expect it to say one thing and it says something entirely different. His name was there 11:45. Langston Price. The slot was flagged in a color she had never seen on the calendar before. A deep charcoal gray that the system used for, she would later learn. A category of appointment that meant do not reschedule, do not move, do not ask questions. She stood up. "I'll let them know you're here," she said, and her voice was different now. Something in it had shifted, slightly the way the temperature shifts when a cloud passes over the sun. He thanked her and sat down in one of the waiting chairs and went back to his phone. He wasn't reading anything important. He was reading about migratory patterns of monarch butterflies. He found this calming. He found most things calming, actually, which was either a gift or a deeply unusual personality trait, depending on who you asked. Inside the boardroom, Elliot Hargrove was not calm. Elliot Hargrove, 61, the son of a man who had built a small insurance firm into a regional powerhouse, and who had then built that powerhouse into something that required 42 floors and a receptionist who knew what a charcoal gray calendar appointment meant. Elliot Hargrove was staring at a spreadsheet that made his hands feel cold. The numbers were not wrong. That was the problem. If they were wrong, he could push back. He could call the analysts, bring in the auditors, find the error and correct it, and go home with the quiet relief of a man who has located the leak and plugged it. But the numbers were correct. Hargrove and Slade had extended a position in a structured credit portfolio that, due to a cascade of events, beginning with a mid-level infrastructure fund, defaulting in Southeast Asia, and ending with a counterparty exposure that nobody had modeled correctly, was now approximately 9 days away from triggering a margin call that would require them to liquidate assets they did not want to liquidate at prices the market would not be kind about. The total exposure was not something Elliot Hargrove was prepared to say out loud yet. Around the table sat 6 people who had been with Hargrove and Slade for a collective 112 years. The head of risk management, whose name was Stuart Pallister, 54, had the look of a man who had been awake since 4 in the morning and had not found what he was looking for. The CFO, a woman named Diane Vickers, 50, had her reading glasses pushed up into her hair and was clicking a pen against the table with the quiet, rhythmic persistence of a person trying not to panic. The general counsel, a man named Roland Fitch, 60, had said nothing for 20 minutes. He was simply watching the spreadsheet, as though it might do something different if he waited long enough. Nobody had said what they were all thinking, which was, "We needed to have caught this earlier, and we did not. And now we are sitting with a problem that is larger than our capacity to solve it quietly. And if it does not get solved quietly, it will not stay quiet." The door opened. Tiffany Owen said, "Mr. Hargrove, Langston Price is here." Elliot Hargrove let out a breath he had been holding, it seemed, since 6 that morning. Stuart Pallister looked up from the spreadsheet. He had heard the name before, somewhere. A conference, maybe. Or a conversation at an industry dinner. One of those names that floated in the background of the financial world, like something you couldn't quite place, but knew mattered. He looked at Diane Vickers. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything, but the look said, "Who exactly is coming through that door?" What came through the door was Langston Price in his grey t-shirt, his coffee still in his hand, his phone now in his pocket, his face carrying the particular expression of someone who has assessed a situation from a distance and already begun forming an opinion about it. He was not what Stuart Pallister had been expecting. Stuart Pallister had been expecting, if he was honest about it, someone who looked more like the room. Someone with a suit. Someone who wore the armor of this world visibly, the way everyone in it seemed to. He had been expecting someone older, maybe, someone who moved with the deliberate weight of a person accustomed to being awaited. Langston Price moved the way he always moved, which was simply forward, without performance. Elliot Hargrove stood up. He reached across the table and shook Langston's hand with both of his, the way men shake hands when they are genuinely relieved to see you. "Thank you for coming," Elliot said. "Of course," Langston said. He sat down in the empty chair at the near end of the table and looked at the spreadsheet on the central screen. He looked at it for perhaps 45 seconds. No one spoke. Then he said, "Is there coffee?" Diane Vickers, who had a law degree and an MBA and had been in this industry for 26 years, found herself getting up to find him coffee. She would think about that later, and she would not entirely understand it, except that there was something about the way he asked. Not commanding, not entitled, just matter of fact, that made it seem like the most sensible thing to do in that moment. Roland Fitch, the general counsel, was watching Langston with the careful attention of a man who had spent decades reading rooms. He was trying to locate something in Langston's manner that he recognized. Some framework, some familiar type, the wonder kind, the turnaround artist, the hired gun with a reputation to protect. He couldn't find it. What he saw was a man who appeared to be simply present, looking at the numbers. Drinking coffee when Diane returned with it, not performing concentration, actually concentrating. Stuart Pallister said, because he was the kind of man who needed to establish parameters. I want to be clear about the scope of what we're dealing with here. Langston looked at him. He said nothing. His expression was not unfriendly. It was simply waiting. Stuart continued. He outlined the exposure, the timeline, the margin trigger date, the assets they would be forced to liquidate if the position wasn't restructured. His voice was professional, clipped, the voice of a man presenting a problem he has already partially accepted he cannot solve. When Stuart finished, Langston said, "Who else knows about this?" Stuart said, "This room." Langston said, "Regulatory." Elliot said, "Not yet." Langston nodded once. He looked at the spreadsheet again. He said, "The infrastructure fund that defaulted, which fund?" Roland named it. Langston said, "Who holds their secondary debt?" A pause. Stuart looked at his laptop. He typed something. He looked up and named a firm. Langston said, "I know someone there." He was quiet for a moment. "The counterparty exposure. Is this the full picture? Or is there more you haven't modeled?" Diane said carefully, "We believe this is the full picture." Langston looked at her. She looked back at him. She said, "There may be another tranche we're still quantifying." He nodded, as though this was what he had expected. Stuart Pallister had been watching this exchange, and something uncomfortable was happening inside him. He was the head of risk management. He had been in this role for 9 years. He had a team of 12 analysts. He had not found the second tranche, he said, his voice taking on an edge he couldn't entirely help. "With respect, I'm not sure what expertise is being brought to bear here. Our team has already modeled every scenario we can identify. The question isn't whether someone can come in and look at our spreadsheet. The question is whether there's an actual solution." The room became quiet in a specific way. The kind of quiet that happens when someone has said something that is almost reasonable, but has a current running under it. Langston looked at Stuart Pallister with the same calm expression he had worn since he walked through the door. He said, "You're right. Looking at a spreadsheet doesn't help anybody." He paused. "Do you want to tell me what solution your team has proposed?" Stuart opened his mouth. He closed it, because Stuart's team had not proposed a solution. Stuart's team had identified the problem with impressive precision, and then hit a wall, which was why Elliot Hargrove had made the call he had made, to the number that not many people had, that connected to a man who answered his own phone. The silence lasted 3 seconds. Diane Vickers said very quietly, "Stuart." Stuart sat back. Langston took a sip of his coffee. He said, "Here's what I think is possible." And then he talked for 40 minutes. He did not use the presentation screen. He did not pull out a laptop. He talked. Sometimes with his eyes on the table. Sometimes with his eyes on the spreadsheet, still visible on the wall, in the even, unhurried way of someone who has done this before in different configurations and recognizes the shape of the problem, even if the details change. He talked about the counterparty exposure and a mechanism through which it might be partially transferred. He talked about a structured agreement with the firm that held the secondary debt and the specific person at that firm who had, twice before, been willing to find creative solutions in exchange for terms that benefited them in ways that didn't appear on a standard balance sheet. He talked about the regulatory timeline and where, within it, there was a window, small, not comfortable, but real, to act before disclosure became mandatory. He talked about the second tranche, the one still being quantified, and what Diane's team would find when they finished the model, and what to do about it when they did. He had not seen all of their books. He had not been briefed in advance. He was working from a spreadsheet and 40 years of accumulated pattern recognition and a memory that retained, with unsettling fidelity, every financial structure he had ever seen dismantled and reassembled. Halfway through, Roland Fitch had opened his legal pad and was writing so quickly his handwriting was deteriorating. Halfway through, Diane Vickers had put her glasses back on her face and pulled her laptop closer, and was pulling up screens, cross-referencing, nodding in a way that was not the polite nodding of someone following along, but the quick, involuntary nodding of someone who has just watched a lock click open. Stuart Pallister was listening. He was not writing anything down. He was simply listening, and his face had the look of a man who had spent a significant amount of energy this morning, believing that the situation was unsolvable, and who was now being forced to reckon with the possibility that he had been wrong. When Langston finished, the room was quiet for a different reason than before. The first quiet had been tension. This quiet was something closer to recalibration. Hargrove said, "Can you walk us through the timeline for the counterparty conversation?" Langston said he could. They talked for another hour and 20 minutes. At some point, Tiffany Owens knocked and brought in sandwiches that nobody had ordered, and that everyone, it turned out, was grateful for. At some point, Roland Fitch ran out of space on his legal pad and asked someone to bring him another one. At some point, Stuart Pallister asked a question that was sharp and specific and technically sophisticated, and Langston answered it with the same patient attention he gave every other question, and something in Stuart's shoulders changed when he heard the answer, a small, almost imperceptible dropping of a weight he had been carrying since 4 in the morning. Outside, in the waiting area, the afternoon light was moving across the floor in long trapezoids, the way it does when the sun is heading west, and the buildings around it are tall enough to break it into pieces. Tiffany Owens was at her desk. She was thinking about something she could not entirely articulate. She was thinking about the man in the grey t-shirt, who had come in looking like someone she would never have imagined belonged in that room, and who had walked out. When the boardroom door finally opened, and Elliot Hargrove walked him to the elevator himself, which Tiffany had worked here 8 months and had never seen Elliot Hargrove do for anyone. Looking exactly the same as when he had walked in. Same t-shirt, same coffee, same phone in his pocket. Not satisfied exactly, not triumphant, just finished. The way a person looks when they have done a thing that needed doing and are now thinking about the next thing. Elliot Hargrove had shaken his hand again in the elevator lobby, and this time he held it with both of his for a moment longer. And he said something to Langston that Tiffany was too far away to hear, and Langston had nodded once and said something brief, and stepped into the elevator and was gone. Elliot Hargrove stood in the elevator lobby for a moment after the doors closed. He looked like a man who had been handed back something he thought he had lost. Then he straightened his jacket and went back to the boardroom. Tiffany sat at her desk and thought about how, when Langston Price had first walked off that elevator, she had looked at him and seen someone who did not belong. She thought about that for a long time. She was still thinking about it 3 weeks later, when the industry newsletter she subscribed to ran a short item. Not a feature, not a headline, barely 4 paragraphs. Noting that a potential credit disruption at a mid-sized financial firm had been resolved without incident, attributed to what the newsletter called strategic restructuring consultation, by a principal whose name it did not print. She had to search for it. The name wasn't in the article. She had to go looking, the way you go looking for a source when you know the story is there, but nobody has written it directly. When she found it, in a footnote, in a secondary source, attributed the way water is attributed to rain, she sat very still at her desk for a moment. Then she thought about the question she had asked him the morning he arrived. "Are you with the building management?" She closed the newsletter. She did not know how to hold exactly the distance between who she had assumed he was and who he actually was. The gap between those two things was wide enough to drive something large through, wide enough to lose things in. She thought about the spreadsheet he had looked at for 45 seconds. She thought about Roland Fitch running out of space on his legal pad. She thought about Stuart Pallister's face in the afternoon light when the boardroom door had opened for a moment, and she had caught a glimpse of the room, the people in it, the particular posture of people who have moved from panic to possibility. Inside that boardroom, in those hours, something had been prevented. Something large and quiet and significant. The kind of thing that, when it doesn't happen, nobody writes about, because nothing happened. The kind of rescue that looks, from the outside, like nothing at all. The kind that only works because the person doing it has no interest in being seen. Langston Price, on the evening after the meeting, had taken the subway home. He had read more about monarch butterflies. He had eaten dinner standing at his kitchen counter. Pasta, something simple, whatever was in the refrigerator. And he had gone to bed early for the first time in several days and slept the sound, complete sleep of a man who has set something right. His phone had rung twice before he fell asleep. He looked at both numbers. He answered one. The conversation was brief. He said yes to something, and he said he would look at it by Friday, and he said good night. He did not read his own name in the newsletter. He did not subscribe to it. He had 7 meetings on his calendar for the following week, in 4 different cities, with 7 different organizations that were in various states of difficulty and had somehow come to know his number. He was not worried about any of them. He would look at each situation with the same patience, the same stillness, the same refusal to decide what something was before he had actually looked at it. 3 of those organizations would later quietly acknowledge, in interviews about their own recoveries, that an outside consultant had been instrumental. None of them would print the name. Some of them, if you pressed, would say something like, "You know how it is. There are people who do this kind of work and they don't make noise about it. You know how it is. There are people who are the loudest thing in a room, who take up all the space available to them, and some that isn't. There are people who walk into a lobby and fill it with presence, who dress in a way that announces them before they speak, who understand that a certain kind of power requires performance. And then there are people who walk off an elevator in a grey t-shirt and get asked if they're there about the HVAC, and who sit down in a chair and drink their coffee, and, without raising their voice once, without displaying a single credential or invoking a single reputation, look at the problem in front of them with open eyes and see something that 9 years and a team of 12 analysts and all the performance of expertise had somehow missed. The monarchs, Langston had read, navigate by the sun, not by landmarks, not by memory of where they went before, by the sun, recalibrated constantly as it moves, an internal compass that adjusts without ever calling attention to itself, that simply always knows which direction is which. He found this, as he found most things, genuinely interesting. He set his phone on the nightstand and closed his eyes and was asleep in 4 minutes. Outside his window, the city made its sounds, traffic and voices, and the particular restless hum of a place that is always somewhere in the middle of itself, never quite arriving, never quite at rest. In a building 42 floors above the street, the lights in a particular boardroom were still on. Diane Vickers was still at the table with her laptop, cross-referencing a model. Roland Fitch had sent his final notes to his paralegal and gone home. Stuart Pallister had stayed an hour after everyone left, sitting alone at the head of the table, going back through the day. He had written one name in the margin of his legal pad, at the very bottom of a page full of numbers. Not a note about the deal, not a follow-up item, just the name, the way you write something when you want to make sure you don't forget it. He had underlined it once, and then he had closed the pad and turned off the light and gone home.